The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone courtyard as Thomas adjusted his red tunic one last time. At 34 years old, he had been standing guard outside Buckingham Palace for what felt like a lifetime, though it had only been 12 years since he first put on the iconic uniform. But his story didn't begin here, among the tourists and camera flashes. 20 years earlier, Thomas was just another teenager from a small town in Yorkshire, working part-time at his father's garage and wondering what to do with his life. His grandfather, a veteran of World War II, would often tell him stories about serving his country and the pride that came with wearing the uniform. Those stories planted a seed that would eventually change everything. When Thomas turned 18, he made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. Instead of following his friends to university or taking over the family business, he walked into the local army recruitment office and signed up. His parents thought he was crazy. His girlfriend at the time said he was throwing his life away. But Thomas felt something calling him toward a different path. Basic training was brutal. The instructors pushed him harder than he had ever been pushed before. Wake-up calls at 5 in the morning, endless drills in the rain, and physical challenges that left him exhausted and questioning his decision. Many of his fellow recruits dropped out in the first few weeks. Thomas stayed. Something inside him refused to quit even when his body screamed for rest and his mind begged for the comfort of home. After 6 months of basic training, Thomas was selected for the Parachute Regiment, one of the most elite units in the British Army. This wasn't just any assignment, it was recognition that he had something special. The training became even more intense. He learned to jump from aircraft at 30,000 feet, navigate hostile terrain with nothing but a compass and map, and fight in conditions that would break most people. His first deployment took him to Afghanistan, where the reality of military life hit him like a brick wall. This wasn't the adventure he had imagined as a teenager. It was serious, dangerous work where mistakes could cost lives. He saw things that would stay with him forever, lost friends who would never make it home, and learned lessons about courage and survival that no classroom could ever teach. During his second tour, something happened that would define the rest of his military career. His unit was ambushed while on patrol in a remote valley. The enemy had them pinned down behind a broken wall, and ammunition was running low. Thomas spotted a sniper position that was causing the most trouble for his team. Without waiting for orders, he crawled 200 yards through enemy fire, neutralized the threat, and created an opening for his unit to escape. The medal ceremony back in England felt surreal. Standing in front of senior officers and dignitaries, Thomas couldn't quite believe that the scared teenager from Yorkshire had become someone worthy of recognition. But more importantly, he had discovered something about himself. He could stay calm under pressure when others panicked, think clearly when chaos surrounded him, and act decisively when lives were on the line. After 8 years in the parachute regiment, Thomas faced a choice. He could continue with active military service, potentially spending more years deployed overseas, or he could apply for a different kind of duty that would keep him in England. The Queen's Guard offered something unique, the chance to serve his country while staying close to home, where he could be near his aging parents and perhaps start building a more stable life. The selection process for the Queen's Guard was nothing like what most people imagined. Yes, there were measurements for height and physical fitness, but there were also extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and interviews that tested character as much as capability. The ceremony and tradition were important, but underneath the pageantry, these were still highly trained soldiers responsible for protecting some of the most important people and places in the country. Training for ceremonial duties was surprisingly challenging. Standing perfectly still for hours at a time was harder than any physical exercise Thomas had done in the parachute regiment. Learning the precise drill movements, memorizing the complex protocols, and mastering the art of remaining completely motionless while tourists tried everything they could think of to get a reaction. It all required a different kind of discipline, but perhaps the most difficult part was learning to look like just another tourist attraction while remaining constantly alert for real threats. The red tunic and tall black hat made him look like a character from a fairy tale. But underneath the costume was a man who had been trained to fight, survive, and protect at the highest level. Thomas's colleagues in the Guard came from similar backgrounds. Each one had earned their place through years of military service and proven themselves under real pressure. They shared stories during their breaks, comparing experiences from different conflicts and different units. The bond between them was strong, built on mutual respect and shared understanding of what it meant to serve. Tourists often asked the same questions when they thought the guards couldn't hear them. Were they real soldiers? Could they actually fight? What would happen if something serious occurred? Most visitors saw only the colorful uniform and the stoic expression, never imagining the extensive training and real-world experience that lay beneath the surface. Thomas had learned to find humor in these misconceptions. He remembered one particularly hot summer day when an American tourist spent 20 minutes trying to make him laugh, eventually giving up with the comment that the guards were probably just actors hired for the day. If only they knew that the man they were trying to embarrass had jumped out of planes, survived combat situations, and could probably handle himself better than anyone else in the vicinity. The daily routine had become second nature. Arrive early, inspect equipment, receive briefings about any special circumstances or potential threats, and then take position for what could be hours of standing in the same spot. The physical demands were real: legs that ached, backs that stiffened, and feet that went numb from standing on stone surfaces. But the mental challenge was even greater, staying alert and ready while appearing completely relaxed and decorative. This particular Tuesday morning had started like any other. Thomas had checked the weather forecast, knowing that rain would make the day more challenging but not impossible. He had eaten a good breakfast, knowing he wouldn't get another chance for several hours. He had called his parents, as he did every few days, listening to his mother worry about his safety, even though his current assignment was probably the safest job he had ever had. As he walked toward his post that morning, Thomas had no idea that this ordinary day would become anything but ordinary. He adjusted his uniform, checked his equipment one final time, and prepared for what he expected would be another routine day of standing guard. While tourists took pictures and children stared in wonder at the man in the funny hat who never moved, the irony wasn't lost on him that after years of active combat duty, it would be during peacetime ceremonial service that he would face one of the most memorable challenges of his military career. The morning had started peacefully enough in St. James's Park, just a short walk from where Thomas stood at his post. What began as a small gathering of about 50 people holding signs and chanting slogans had grown into something much larger and more unpredictable. The original protesters were there for a cause they believed in deeply, concerns about government policies that affected their daily lives. At first, everything seemed under control. The protesters had proper permits, police officers were stationed nearby keeping a respectful distance, and the whole thing looked like it would be another routine demonstration in the heart of London. Families with children walked through the park as usual, tourists continued taking photos, and life went on normally around the edges of the gathering. But London protests have a way of attracting attention from all sides. Word had spread through social media, and by mid-morning the crowd had doubled in size. Some of the newcomers weren't there to support the original cause. They had their own agendas and their own anger to express. The atmosphere began to shift from peaceful demonstration to something more tense and unpredictable. Detective Inspector Williams, who was coordinating the police response from a command vehicle parked nearby, noticed the change immediately. He had been managing public order situations for 15 years and could sense when things were about to go wrong. The chanting was getting louder, more aggressive. People were pushing closer together instead of maintaining the respectful spacing they had started with. Most concerning of all, he spotted several individuals who weren't carrying signs or participating in the chants, but were instead moving through the crowd with a different energy entirely. The counter-protesters arrived around 11:30, and that's when everything started to unravel. They came in organized groups, clearly prepared for confrontation rather than peaceful expression of their views. They had their own signs, their own chants, and most importantly, their own anger that had been building for weeks. Within minutes of their arrival, the two groups were shouting at each other across the police barriers that separated them. Officer Johnson, a constable with just 2 years of experience, was positioned between the two groups when the first push happened. He couldn't even tell who started it. One moment he was watching people hold signs and shout slogans. The next moment bodies were pressing against the metal barriers and voices were raised in genuine anger rather than political protest. His radio crackled with reports from other officers around the perimeter, all describing the same sudden escalation. The problem with crowds is that they have their own psychology, completely different from the individuals who make them up. People who would never dream of starting a fight in their normal lives suddenly find themselves caught up in group energy that pushes them toward actions they would later struggle to explain. The peaceful protesters found themselves being pushed and shoved by people they had never seen before. The counter-protesters, who had come expecting trouble, suddenly had all the justification they needed to create it. Sergeant Collins, the senior officer on scene, made the decision to call for riot control backup when he saw how quickly things were deteriorating. In his experience, it was better to have too many officers available than to find yourself overwhelmed by a situation that spiraled out of control. The riot officers were stationed just a few blocks away, and he knew they could be on scene within minutes if needed, but crowds don't wait for backup to arrive. A water bottle flew through the air. Nobody could say later whether it came from the protesters or counter-protesters, but it hit someone on the head and suddenly people weren't just shouting anymore. They were pushing forward against the barriers, trying to get at each other across the police line. Officer Johnson found himself pressed against the metal barrier, struggling to maintain the separation between two groups of very angry people. The first breakthrough happened at the eastern edge of the crowd, where the barriers met the park's iron fence. A group of about 10 people, frustrated by their inability to reach the other side, decided to go around instead of through. They pushed past the single officer stationed at that corner and suddenly found themselves with a clear path toward the center of London and toward Buckingham Palace. What happened next was exactly what crowd control experts always worried about. Success in one location inspired similar actions elsewhere. Seeing that some people had managed to break through the police line, others began trying the same thing at different points. Within 5 minutes, small groups were spreading out from the main protest in multiple directions, each one requiring police attention that was already stretched thin. Detective Inspector Williams watched the situation unfold from his command position and realized that his worst-case scenario was becoming reality. Instead of one manageable crowd in one location, he now had multiple smaller groups moving through central London with no clear destination and no apparent leadership. Some were heading toward government buildings, others toward tourist areas, and at least one group was moving in the direction of the palace. The 3 riot officers who would soon encounter Thomas had been part of the backup team called in to help. Officers Blake, Patterson, and Rodriguez had arrived expecting to help maintain a perimeter around a static protest. Instead, they found themselves chasing a group of about 8 people who had broken away from the main crowd and were now moving through the streets with what appeared to be no clear plan beyond causing disruption. The chase had started near Westminster Bridge and wound through several streets before the group split up. Most of them had been corralled by other officers, but 3 individuals had managed to stay ahead of pursuit and were now approaching the area around Buckingham Palace. Blake and his colleagues had been running for almost 10 minutes, their heavy riot gear making the pursuit exhausting and frustrating. By the time they reached the palace grounds, the 3 people they had been chasing had disappeared into the crowd of tourists that always surrounded the famous landmark. Blake was frustrated, Patterson was out of breath, and Rodriguez was questioning whether the chase had been worth the effort. They found themselves standing near the ceremonial guard post, surrounded by tourists taking photos and street performers entertaining children. The contrast was jarring. Just minutes earlier, they had been dealing with angry crowds, flying objects, and the very real possibility of serious violence. Now they were in what looked like a scene from a tourism brochure, complete with a guard in a bright red uniform, standing perfectly still while families posed for pictures nearby. It was Rodriguez who first noticed how the tourists were treating the guard like a statue, a photo opportunity, something decorative rather than a real person doing a real job. Children were making faces at him, trying to get him to react. Adults were commenting loudly about whether he was even a real soldier or just an actor hired to look impressive. Blake, still frustrated from the failed pursuit and looking for somewhere to direct his adrenaline, began to see the guard differently. Here was someone who appeared to be playing dress-up while real police officers were dealing with actual problems just a few blocks away. The more he thought about it, the more the whole situation seemed ridiculous. The stage was set for a confrontation that none of them could have predicted when their shifts began that morning. Blake wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked around at the scene in front of him. After 10 minutes of running through London streets chasing protesters who had vanished into thin air, he found himself standing in what felt like a completely different world. Tourists were everywhere, snapping photos and chatting excitedly in dozens of different languages. Street vendors were selling postcards and souvenirs. Children were pointing and giggling at the motionless figure in the bright red uniform. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. Just blocks away, his colleagues were still dealing with angry crowds, flying bottles, and the very real possibility that someone could get seriously hurt. Here, it looked like a theme park. Blake felt his frustration building as he watched families treat the guard like he was part of a museum display rather than a real person doing a real job. Patterson caught his breath and shook his head in disbelief. He had been a police officer for 8 years, and he had seen plenty of ceremonial guards during his time in London. But after the morning they had just experienced, the whole thing seemed almost insulting. While they were out there getting pushed around by angry protesters, this guy got to stand still and look impressive for tourists. Rodriguez was the most experienced of the three, with 12 years on the force, but even he was feeling the effects of the failed chase. They had been so close to catching the troublemakers, only to lose them in the crowd near the palace. Now they were standing here watching someone whose biggest challenge appeared to be not blinking while people took selfies. The tourists around them didn't help the situation. Blake overheard an American family discussing whether the guard was even real or just a very lifelike statue. A group of teenagers were making increasingly ridiculous faces, trying to get some kind of reaction. One businessman was explaining loudly to his companion that these guards were just for show and probably couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag. That last comment hit Blake particularly hard. He had spent the morning dealing with real violence, real danger, and real consequences. His riot gear was heavy, his body was tired, and his patience was wearing thin. To hear someone dismiss a fellow member of the security services as useless decoration felt like a personal insult to everyone who put their life on the line to keep the peace. Thomas, standing perfectly still in his ceremonial position, was aware of everything happening around him. The training for the Queen's Guard included learning to hear and process information, while appearing completely disconnected from the world. He had noticed the 3 Riot officers arrive, had seen their body language, and could sense the tension they were carrying from whatever situation they had just left. He had also heard the comments from the tourists. After 12 years in this position, Thomas had heard every possible opinion about what he did and who he was. Most of it rolled off him like water off a duck's back. He understood that people saw the uniform and the ceremony and drew their own conclusions. Very few tourists had any idea about the background, training, or capabilities of the men who wore the red tunics, but Thomas could also sense that today was different. The 3 officers weren't just tired from a routine patrol. They had the specific kind of energy that comes from adrenaline that hasn't been released, from frustration that hasn't been resolved. He had felt that same energy many times during his military service, and he knew it could lead to poor decisions if it wasn't managed properly. Blake made the first move toward confrontation, but it wasn't planned or deliberate. He was watching. A group of tourists posed for photos, pointing and laughing at the guard, when his frustration finally boiled over. He turned to Patterson and Rodriguez and said, just loud enough for nearby people to hear, that he wondered if the guard was even a real soldier or just some actor they hired to look tough. Patterson, still catching his breath and dealing with his own frustration, joined in. He made a comment about how easy the guard's job looked compared to what they had been doing all morning. Standing still and looking pretty seemed like a pretty good deal compared to chasing criminals through the streets of London. Rodriguez tried to be the voice of reason, suggesting they should probably get back to their assigned area and check in with their supervisor. But Blake was already committed to his course of action. The morning's events had left him feeling like he needed to prove something, though he couldn't have explained exactly what or why. The conversation grew louder as more tourists began to notice what was happening. Instead of just taking photos of the guard, people were now watching an interaction between the guard and 3 police officers. Some started recording with their phones, sensing that they might be witnessing something unusual. Blake stepped closer to Thomas, close enough that his voice wouldn't be lost in the general noise of the crowd. He made a comment about wondering what would happen if someone actually challenged one of these ceremonial guards. Would they know what to do, or would they just stand there looking confused? Thomas heard every word, but his training kept him perfectly still and silent. The Queen's Guard protocols were very clear about how to handle situations like this. Ignore provocation, maintain dignity, and only respond if there was a genuine threat to security or safety. 3 police officers making comments didn't qualify as either, no matter how inappropriate their behavior might be, but Blake interpreted the lack of response as confirmation of his suspicions. Here was someone who looked tough but couldn't even defend himself verbally when challenged. The frustration from the morning's failed pursuit, combined with the contrast between his difficult job and what appeared to be the guard's easy assignment, pushed him toward a decision that would change everything. Patterson realized what was about to happen and tried one more time to talk Blake out of it. They were police officers, he reminded him, and they had better things to do than harass someone who was just doing his job. But Blake was past listening to reason. The combination of physical exhaustion, professional frustration, and wounded pride had created a perfect storm of poor judgment. The crowd of tourists was growing larger as word spread that something interesting was happening. People who had been focused on their sightseeing were now turning their attention to the developing confrontation. Phones were coming out, cameras were being aimed, and what had started as a private moment of frustration was becoming a very public spectacle. Rodriguez made one final attempt to defuse the situation. He suggested they should respect a fellow member of the security services and move on to more important matters. But Blake had already made up his mind. He was going to find out once and for all whether these ceremonial guards were real soldiers or just well-dressed actors. Thomas could feel the energy in the crowd changing. What had been casual tourist interest was becoming focused attention on a confrontation that was about to unfold. His military training kicked in automatically, assessing the situation, identifying potential threats, and preparing for multiple possible outcomes. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. After years of combat deployment and real-world military operations, he was about to face one of his most challenging moments while wearing a ceremonial uniform and standing in front of one of London's most famous tourist attractions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would surprise everyone involved. Blake took a deep breath and stepped forward. The decision had been building in his mind for the past few minutes, fueled by frustration, exhaustion, and a growing need to prove something he couldn't quite put into words. Around him, the crowd of tourists sensed that something was about to happen. Conversations quieted, phones were raised, and all attention focused on the scene unfolding in front of Buckingham Palace. Thomas remained perfectly still, but every muscle in his body was alert. Years of military training had taught him to recognize the exact moment when a situation moves from verbal posturing to physical action. Blake's body language, his breathing, the way he positioned his feet, everything indicated that the talking was about to stop and something more serious was about to begin. The ceremonial rifle that Thomas carried wasn't just for show, though most tourists assumed it was. It was a real weapon, properly maintained and inspected daily, though it wasn't loaded during ceremonial duties. What most people didn't realize was that the rifle also served as a tool, a perfectly balanced piece of equipment that could be used defensively if the situation required it. Blake made his move with the confidence of someone who had never doubted the outcome. In his mind, this was going to be simple. The guard would be caught off guard, probably embarrassed in front of all these tourists, and maybe that would teach him something about the difference between playing soldier and being a real police officer dealing with real problems. He lunged forward, reaching for the rifle with both hands. His plan was straightforward: grab the weapon, show everyone how unprepared the ceremonial guard really was, and maybe get a few laughs from the crowd while proving his point. Blake had handled many confrontations during his police career, and he was confident in his physical abilities, but the moment his hands made contact with the rifle, Blake realized he had made a serious miscalculation. Instead of the easy victory he had expected, he found himself dealing with someone who moved with the precision and speed of a trained professional. Thomas didn't panic, didn't hesitate, and didn't waste a single motion in his response. The first thing Blake noticed was that the rifle didn't move the way he expected it to. Instead of being pulled toward him or away from the guard, it seemed to pivot in place using some kind of leverage that he didn't understand. His grip, which had felt secure when he first grabbed the weapon, suddenly became awkward and ineffective. Thomas had recognized the attack for what it was the moment Blake moved. This wasn't a real threat to security, it was a challenge from someone who thought they knew more than they actually did. But even though it wasn't a genuine security threat, it was still an attack on a member of the Queen's Guard, and that required a proper response. The defensive technique Thomas used was something he had learned during his military training and practiced countless times over the years. It was designed to neutralize an attack while using minimal force, perfect for a situation where the goal was to stop an aggressor without causing serious injury. The movement looked simple to anyone watching, but it required precise timing and perfect body mechanics. Blake found himself moving in a direction he hadn't planned to go. The rifle, which he had thought he was controlling, was now controlling him. His forward momentum, which should have carried him closer to the guard, was being redirected to his left. Worse yet, he was losing his balance, something that hadn't happened to him in a physical confrontation since his early days as a police officer. The tourists watching were getting exactly the kind of show they had hoped for when they started recording. But instead of seeing a ceremonial guard being embarrassed by a real police officer, they were witnessing something much more impressive. The guard, who had appeared to be nothing more than a colorful statue, was moving with the fluid precision of someone who clearly knew exactly what he was doing. Patterson watched in amazement as his colleague's confident attack turned into an awkward stumble. Blake was a strong guy, experienced in handling physical confrontations, and he had seemed so sure of himself just moments before. Now he looked completely out of his depth, struggling to maintain his balance while the guard remained as calm and controlled as he had been when standing perfectly still. Thomas maintained his grip on the rifle throughout the entire exchange. To the casual observer, it might have looked like Blake was the one in control, grabbing the weapon and forcing the action. But anyone with military experience would have recognized immediately that the guard was the one dictating how the confrontation unfolded. The movement was so smooth and controlled that it almost looked choreographed. Blake's forward lunge became a sideways stumble. His aggressive grab became an ineffective fumble, and his confident attack became an embarrassing demonstration of the difference between assuming someone doesn't know how to fight and discovering that they definitely do. Rodriguez, watching from a few feet away, felt his stomach drop as he realized what was actually happening. This wasn't going the way any of them had expected. The guard wasn't just standing there taking abuse, he was handling Blake like a professional handling an amateur. And if Blake was having this much trouble, what did that say about the rest of them? Blake tried to recover his balance and his dignity at the same time. The stumble had been bad enough, but doing it in front of dozens of tourists with cameras was making everything worse. He could hear people in the crowd reacting, some with surprise, others with what sounded like amusement. This was definitely not going according to plan, but Thomas wasn't finished demonstrating the difference between ceremonial duty and combat capability. As Blake struggled to regain his footing, the guard smoothly returned to his original position, rifle properly positioned, looking exactly as composed and unruffled as he had before the confrontation began. It was as if nothing had happened, except for the police officer now standing awkwardly to one side, clearly shaken by the unexpected outcome. The contrast was striking. Blake was breathing hard, his uniform disheveled, his confidence clearly rattled. Thomas looked exactly the same as he had 10 minutes earlier, perfectly groomed, completely calm and ready for whatever might happen next. The message was clear to everyone watching. This was not someone who could be easily intimidated or overpowered. Patterson felt the situation slipping away from them. What had started as Blake's attempt to prove a point was turning into a very public demonstration of their own limitations. The crowd was growing larger as word spread that something interesting was happening, and more phones were recording every moment of what was becoming an increasingly embarrassing situation. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. They had come here frustrated by their inability to catch a few protesters, looking for someone to take that frustration out on. Instead, they had found someone who was clearly more capable than they had given him credit for. Blake's failed attack hadn't proven that ceremonial guards were useless. It had proven exactly the opposite. Thomas could see that Patterson was weighing his options, probably wondering whether to try to de-escalate the situation or to join his colleague in what was becoming a very one-sided confrontation. The guard's military experience told him that the smart thing would be for the officers to walk away now, before things got any worse for them, but pride and embarrassment don't always lead to smart decisions, especially when there's an audience watching. Patterson watched Blake stumble away from the guard, his face red with embarrassment and frustration. The confident attack had turned into an awkward retreat in less than 5 seconds, and now dozens of tourists were recording what was clearly not going according to plan. Patterson felt his own pride taking a hit just by association. They were supposed to be the professionals here, the ones with training and experience in handling confrontations, but seeing his colleagues struggle only made Patterson more determined to prove that Blake's failure was just a fluke. Maybe Blake had been tired from the chase, or maybe he had just approached the situation wrong. Patterson had been a police officer for 8 years, had handled his share of violent suspects, and he wasn't about to be shown up by someone whose biggest challenge was usually standing still for tourists. The crowd around them was growing larger and more engaged. What had started as casual tourist photography was now turning into a proper spectacle. People were calling their friends over, pointing excitedly at the scene unfolding in front of the palace. Street vendors had stopped selling souvenirs to watch what was happening. Even other guards at nearby positions were stealing glances, though. They maintained their ceremonial poses. Patterson made his decision quickly, perhaps too quickly. While Blake was still recovering from his embarrassing encounter, Patterson moved in from the right side, hoping to catch the guard off balance. His plan was different from Blake's. Instead of going for the rifle, he would use his Riot baton to control the situation. He had trained extensively with the weapon and felt confident in his ability to use it effectively. Thomas had been expecting this. Military training teaches you to think several moves ahead, especially when dealing with multiple opponents. He had seen Patterson positioning himself for an attack while Blake was still stumbling around, and he was ready when the second officer made his move. Patterson came in fast and aggressive, swinging his baton in what should have been a controlling move rather than a harmful one. His intention was to force the guard to defend himself and hopefully create an opening to disarm him. Patterson had used similar techniques many times during his police career, and they had always worked before. What happened next was unlike anything Patterson had experienced in 8 years of law enforcement. Instead of backing away or raising his hands defensively, the guard moved toward the attack. It was completely counterintuitive. When someone swings a weapon at you, your natural instinct is to move away from it, not toward it, but Thomas did exactly the opposite, and it changed everything. The movement was so quick and precise that most of the watching tourists missed exactly what happened. One moment, Patterson was attacking with his baton, looking confident and in control. The next moment, he was on the ground with his weapon somehow in the guard's possession. Looking confused and completely outmatched, Thomas had used Patterson's own momentum against him, a technique that was part physics and part timing. When someone attacks with a weapon, they commit their body weight and energy to that attack. If you can redirect that energy instead of opposing it, the attacker becomes their own worst enemy. Patterson's aggressive charge became an uncontrolled fall, and his grip on the baton became a liability rather than an advantage. The speed of the whole exchange was what made it so impressive to watch. From the moment Patterson started his attack to the moment he hit the ground was less than 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, Thomas had demonstrated the kind of training and skill that takes years to develop and even longer to master. Rodriguez felt his confidence evaporating as he watched his second colleague get thoroughly outclassed by someone they had all assumed would be an easy target. This wasn't just luck or coincidence anymore. The guard was clearly operating on a completely different level than any of them had expected, and Rodriguez was starting to realize that they had made a serious mistake in judgment. Patterson tried to get back to his feet quickly, hoping to minimize the embarrassment, but the fall had been harder than he wanted to admit. His Riot gear, which was designed to protect him, had actually made the impact worse by adding weight to his fall. He felt bruised, both physically and professionally, and he could hear the crowd's reaction to what they had just witnessed. The tourists were no longer just recording casually. Many of them were now actively cheering for the guard, impressed by what they were seeing. Comments in various languages rippled through the crowd, but the tone was universal. People were amazed by the skill they had just witnessed. Some were calling friends on their phones, telling them to hurry over because something incredible was happening at the palace. Thomas maintained his professional composure throughout the entire encounter. Even while disarming Patterson and putting him on the ground, his expression never changed from the stoic mask that was part of his ceremonial role. To anyone watching, it looked like he was simply taking care of a minor disruption before returning to his normal duties, but the baton in his left hand told a different story. What had been Patterson's weapon was now under the guard's control, held with the casual confidence of someone who was completely comfortable with its weight and balance. Thomas had training with similar weapons from his military service, and the Riot baton was actually lighter and easier to handle than some of the equipment he had used in combat situations. Blake, still recovering from his own failed attack, watched in disbelief as Patterson suffered an even more embarrassing defeat. The confidence that had driven them to challenge the guard in the first place was completely gone now, replaced by a growing realization that they had seriously underestimated their opponent. The situation was becoming more than just a personal embarrassment. Other police officers in the area were probably hearing about what was happening through radio chatter. Their supervisor would want to know why 3 of his officers were involved in some kind of confrontation with a ceremonial guard instead of focusing on their assigned duties. What had started as a way to blow off steam was turning into a potential career problem. Rodriguez found himself in an impossible position. 2 of his colleagues had already been thoroughly defeated, but walking away now would look like cowardice in front of dozens of witnesses. At the same time, attacking the guard after seeing what had happened to Blake and Patterson seemed like a guaranteed way to join them in humiliation. The crowd was getting larger and more excited with each passing minute. Word was spreading through the tourist area that something amazing was happening at the guard post. People were abandoning their planned sightseeing to come watch what was turning into the most entertaining thing they had seen during their visit to London. Thomas could sense the shift in the crowd's energy. What had started as curiosity was now becoming genuine entertainment. The tourists weren't just watching a confrontation anymore, they were watching a demonstration of skill that they would probably talk about for years. Many of them had probably never seen anything like this outside of movies. The guard's training told him that the situation was reaching a critical point. 2 attackers had been neutralized, but there was still a 3rd officer who hadn't made his move yet. Rodriguez looked hesitant, probably weighing his options, but pride and peer pressure could still push him toward a decision. he would regret. Thomas adjusted his grip on the confiscated baton, not in a threatening way, but with the casual competence of someone who was completely comfortable with the weapon. The message was clear to anyone paying attention. He was ready for whatever came next, and the previous two encounters had been warm-up exercises rather than serious challenges. The stage was set for the final confrontation. Rodriguez stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only 10 seconds. Around him, the crowd of tourists had grown into a proper audience. All phones pointed in his direction, all eyes waiting to see what would happen. Next, his two colleagues were picking themselves up off the ground, looking embarrassed and defeated. The ceremonial guard stood calmly with Patterson's baton in one hand and his rifle in the other, looking like he could handle whatever came next without breaking a sweat. This wasn't how Rodriguez had imagined his day going when he put on his riot gear that morning. 12 years of police experience had taught him to read situations carefully, and everything about this one was screaming that he should walk away. But walking away now, in front of all these people, after watching his colleagues get thoroughly outclassed, felt impossible. His pride wouldn't let him do it. Even though his common sense was telling him it was the smart choice, the crowd was getting restless, waiting for the next part of the show. Some tourists were making comments about whether the third officer would be brave enough to try his luck. Others were placing informal bets on how quickly the guard would handle this next challenge. A few were calling out encouragement to Rodriguez, though it wasn't clear whether they wanted him to attack or retreat. Thomas could see the internal struggle playing out on Rodriguez's face. Years of combat experience had taught him to recognize when someone was weighing their options, trying to find a way out of a situation that had gotten bigger than they expected. The guard actually felt some sympathy for the officer's position. Pride and peer pressure could push people into decisions they would regret later, but Rodriguez was also the most experienced of the three officers, and that experience was telling him things his pride didn't want to hear. He had watched two competent police officers get handled like beginners by someone they had all assumed would be an easy target. The guard's movements had been too smooth, too precise, too professional to be anything other than the result of serious training and real experience. Rodriguez made his decisions slowly and carefully. Unlike his colleagues who had charged in with confidence and aggression, he approached the situation like the experienced officer he was. He circled around to the left, keeping his distance, watching for any signs of how the guard might react to his approach. His riot shield was positioned defensively, and his movements were cautious rather than aggressive. Thomas noticed the difference immediately. This officer was thinking instead of just reacting, which made him both more dangerous and more worthy of respect. Rodriguez wasn't letting emotion drive his decisions the way Blake and Patterson had. He was treating this like a real tactical situation rather than a schoolyard challenge. The crowd sensed the change in atmosphere too. Where the first two confrontations had been quick and explosive, this one felt more like a chess match. Rodriguez was taking his time, looking for an opening, trying to find some advantage that his colleagues had missed. The tourists quieted down, recognizing that they were about to see something different from what had happened before. Rodriguez tested the guard with a few small movements, stepping closer and then backing away, shifting his shield position, looking for any reaction that might give him information about what to expect. But Thomas remained perfectly still except for his eyes, which tracked every movement with the calm attention of someone who had faced much more dangerous opponents in much more serious situations. When Rodriguez finally made his move, it was with the calculated approach of an experienced officer rather than the rushed attack of someone letting frustration drive their decisions. He came in low and controlled, using his shield to protect himself while trying to get close enough to use his superior size and weight to his advantage. It was a smart approach that might have worked against most opponents, but Thomas had been trained to deal with multiple attackers using various weapons and tactics. Rodriguez's careful approach was actually easier to handle than the wild charges his colleagues had made, because it was more predictable and gave the guard more time to plan his response. Sometimes in combat, thinking too much can be just as Dangerous as not thinking at all. The exchange that followed was like watching a masterclass in defensive techniques. Rodriguez pressed forward with his shield, trying to use it to control distance and create openings for follow-up moves. Thomas used the confiscated baton to redirect the shield's momentum, turning Rodriguez's advance into an awkward sideways movement that left him off balance and vulnerable. What made it even more impressive was that Thomas never seemed to be working hard, while Rodriguez was straining with effort, breathing hard from the physical exertion of moving in heavy riot gear. The guard looked like he was barely paying attention. His movements were economical and precise, never wasting energy on unnecessary motion or dramatic gestures. The shield, which should have been Rodriguez's main advantage, became a liability when Thomas got inside its protective arc. The weight that made it effective for defense made it clumsy for close-quarters maneuvering. Rodriguez found himself trying to control a piece of equipment that was working against him rather than for him. While the guard seemed to anticipate every move he made, the end came faster than anyone expected. One moment Rodriguez was pressing his attack, trying to use his shield to create an opening. The next moment, he was sitting on the ground with his shield several feet away, looking stunned and completely outmaneuvered. The transition had been so smooth that many in the crowd weren't sure exactly what had happened. Thomas stood calmly with the riot baton still in his left hand, his ceremonial rifle properly positioned in his right, looking exactly as composed as he had at the beginning of the entire encounter. Around him, 3 police officers were slowly getting to their feet, all looking like they had just learned something they wished they had known before starting this confrontation. The crowd erupted in spontaneous applause. What they had just witnessed was unlike anything they had expected to see during a routine visit to Buckingham Palace. The ceremonial guard, who they had assumed was just a tourist attraction, had just demonstrated a level of skill and professionalism that left everyone impressed and amazed. Rodriguez felt the sting of defeat, more than his colleagues, because he had approached the situation more thoughtfully. Blake and Patterson could tell themselves they had been tired or caught off guard. Rodriguez had tried his best tactical approach and still been completely outclassed. It was a humbling experience that would stick with him for a long time. Blake and Patterson helped Rodriguez to his feet, all 3 of them now forced to confront the reality that they had seriously misjudged their opponent. The guard wasn't just someone in a colorful costume. He was a highly trained professional who had been playing on a completely different level than any of them had realized. The tourists around them were still recording, still talking excitedly about what they had witnessed. Social media posts were probably already going live, sharing videos of the most unexpected tourist attraction any of them had ever seen. The story would spread far beyond the people who had actually been there to witness it. Thomas remained at his post, having returned Rodriguez's shield to a position where the officer could retrieve it without further embarrassment. The message was clear, the confrontation was over, and it was time for everyone to return to their normal activities. He had made his point without causing any serious injury or lasting harm. The 3 officers found themselves in the awkward position of having to walk away from a confrontation they had started and clearly lost. But there was something about the guards' professional demeanor that made it easier to accept their defeat with whatever dignity they had left. The silence that followed the end of the confrontation was almost deafening. For several seconds, nobody moved, nobody spoke, and even the constant background noise of London traffic seemed muted. The 3 police officers stood there, dusting themselves off and trying to process what had just happened. The crowd of tourists remained frozen, phones still recording, unsure whether the show was over or if there was more to come. Thomas stood exactly where he had been throughout the entire encounter, but now the dynamics had completely changed. Instead of being the target of 3 aggressive officers, he was clearly the one in control of the situation. The riot baton remained in his left hand, not held threateningly, but with the casual confidence of someone who knew exactly how to use it. His ceremonial rifle was properly positioned in his right hand, and his posture was as perfect as it had been before any of this started. What happened next would define not just how this particular incident ended, but how everyone involved would. Remember it for years to come? Thomas had several options available to him, and the choice he made would say everything about his character, his training, and his understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. He could have pressed his advantage. 3 police officers had just attacked him without justification in front of dozens of witnesses, and he would have been well within his rights to escalate the situation. He could have called for backup, filed formal complaints, or used his position to ensure that Blake, Patterson, and Rodriguez faced serious consequences for their actions. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses were abundant, and the video footage would support whatever version of events he chose to present. He could have embarrassed them further. The crowd was clearly on his side now, impressed by his skill and professionalism. A few well-chosen words about police officers who couldn't handle a single ceremonial guard would have gotten laughs and probably gone viral on social media. The 3 officers were vulnerable, their confidence shattered, and it would have been easy to humiliate them completely. But Thomas chose a different path, one that revealed the depth of his character and the quality of his training. Instead of pursuing any kind of revenge or escalation, he simply returned the confiscated baton to Patterson with a slight nod that managed to convey both acknowledgement of what had happened and an indication that, as far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. The gesture was so unexpected that Patterson almost didn't know how to respond. He had been prepared for consequences, for lectures, for formal complaints that could affect his career. Instead, he found himself receiving his weapon back from someone who had every reason to make his life difficult but was choosing not to do so. Thomas then took a step back and resumed his ceremonial position, his rifle properly positioned, his posture perfect, his expression returning to the stoic mask that was part of his official duties. To anyone arriving on the scene at that moment, it would have looked like nothing had happened at all. The only signs of the recent confrontation were 3 disheveled police officers and a crowd of excited tourists still holding their phones. The crowd began to realize that the show was truly over. Some started applauding again, but more quietly, this time sensing that the guard had returned to his official duties and was no longer engaging with the spectacle. Others began to disperse, eager to share their videos and tell their friends about the amazing thing they had just witnessed at Buckingham Palace. Blake felt a mixture of relief and confusion. He had expected consequences for his actions, and the absence of any punishment felt almost worse than facing charges would have. The guards' restraint highlighted how unnecessary and inappropriate their challenge had been. If this had been someone looking for trouble, someone eager to use his skills against fellow members of the security services, the situation could have ended very differently. Rodriguez, being the most experienced of the 3, understood better than his colleagues what had just happened. The guard hadn't just demonstrated superior fighting skills, he had shown the kind of professional judgment and restraint that separated true professionals from people who just happened to be good at violence. It was a lesson in leadership, character, and self-control that Rodriguez knew he would remember for the rest of his career. Patterson retrieved his baton and shield, still struggling to process the gap between what he had expected to happen and what had actually occurred. The guard had handled all 3 of them with what appeared to be minimal effort, but he had done it in a way that left their dignity more or less intact. No one had been seriously hurt. No one had been publicly humiliated beyond the natural consequences of their own actions, and no one was facing career-ending repercussions. The tourists who remained nearby were now looking at the guard with a completely different perspective. What had appeared to be a colorful costume and ceremonial role was now clearly revealed as the uniform of a highly trained professional doing a serious job. The red tunic and tall black hat no longer looked like tourist attractions. They looked like the working clothes of someone who had earned the right to wear them. Captain Morrison, Thomas's commanding officer, had been watching the entire encounter from a position about 50 yards away. He had seen the situation developing and had been prepared to intervene if necessary, but he had also been curious to see how his most experienced guard would handle the challenge. What he had witnessed exceeded even his high expectations. Morrison approached the scene as the crowd was dispersing, not to reprimand anyone or escalate the situation, but to quietly check that everything was resolved. He nodded to Thomas, a gesture that conveyed approval and support without drawing attention to the command structure. He also acknowledged the three police officers with a look that managed to be both understanding and slightly disapproving. The incident could have become a diplomatic nightmare. Police officers attacking a member of the Queen's Guard in front of tourists and cameras had the potential to create headlines, investigations, and formal complaints that could damage relationships between different branches of the security services. Instead, Thomas's restraint had turned a potential crisis into a demonstration of professionalism that reflected well on everyone involved. Blake, Patterson, and Rodriguez found themselves in the unusual position of being grateful to someone they had just attacked. The guards' decision not to pursue the matter officially meant they could return to their duties without facing the career consequences their actions probably deserved. It was a level of mercy they hadn't expected and probably wouldn't have shown if the roles had been reversed. As the three officers finally walked away from the scene, they carried with them a new understanding of what it meant to be a true professional. They had learned that real strength wasn't about proving dominance over others, but about knowing when and how to use your abilities appropriately. They had also learned that appearances could be very deceiving, and that dismissing someone based on their role or uniform was a mistake they wouldn't make again. Thomas remained at his post for the rest of his shift, standing with the same perfect posture and stoic expression he had maintained for 12 years. But the tourists who passed by for the rest of the day looked at him with a different kind of respect, knowing they were in the presence of someone truly exceptional. Within an hour of the confrontation, the first video had already been uploaded to social media. A teenage tourist from Australia had captured the entire sequence on her phone, and her shaky footage would soon be viewed by millions of people around the world. The caption she wrote was simple but effective. Royal Guard shows 3 police officers what real training looks like. This guy is incredible. The video spread faster than anyone could have predicted. By lunchtime, it had been shared thousands of times across different platforms. People were tagging their friends, adding their own commentary, and creating clips that focused on different parts of the encounter. The most popular version would eventually accumulate over 50 million views, making Thomas one of the most famous ceremonial guards in history, though he would never know it. Blake, Patterson, and Rodriguez returned to their station that afternoon to find their colleagues already talking about the incident. Word had spread through the police force even faster than it had spread through social media, though the version circulating among officers was more accurate and less sensationalized than what was appearing online. Their supervisor, Sergeant Collins, called them into his office not to discipline them, but to make sure they understood what had happened and why. Collins had watched the video himself, along with several other senior officers, and their consensus was clear. The 3 officers had acted inappropriately, but the guard's restraint had prevented what could have been a serious diplomatic incident. Instead of facing formal charges or career consequences, Blake, Patterson, and Rodriguez were assigned to additional training sessions, focused on inter-service cooperation and professional conduct. The training sessions turned out to be more educational than punitive. The instructors brought in military personnel to explain the background and qualifications required for ceremonial duties, and all 3 officers were surprised to learn about the combat experience and specialized training that most ceremonial guards possessed. What they had assumed was a decorative role was actually a highly selective assignment given only to proven professionals. Thomas completed his shift that day exactly as he always did, standing his post with perfect posture until he was relieved by the next guard. He walked back to the guardhouse, changed out of his ceremonial uniform, and headed home without any idea that his actions were already being discussed in police stations, military barracks, and government offices across London. Captain Morrison, however, was very aware of the attention the incident was attracting. By evening, he had received calls from senior officers in multiple branches of the military, all asking for details about what had happened and expressing admiration for how Thomas had handled the situation. The consensus was that the Guard had represented the service with exceptional professionalism under unusual circumstances. The formal recognition came 2 weeks later, though it was handled quietly to avoid drawing more attention to an incident that everyone preferred to treat as closed. Thomas was commended by both his military superiors and representatives from the Metropolitan Police for his restraint, professionalism, and demonstration of the values expected from members of the Queen's Guard. The commendation went into his service record, but he was asked not to discuss the incident publicly. The 3 police officers involved experienced their own form of recognition, though it was quite different from what Thomas received. Their story became a case study in police training programs, used to illustrate the importance of avoiding assumptions and treating all members of the security services with appropriate respect. Blake, Patterson, and Rodriguez became reluctant. Examples of what not to do, though their names were never used in the training materials. The incident had a lasting impact on how police officers interacted with ceremonial guards throughout London. Word spread quickly through the force that these were not just tourist attractions in costume, but highly trained professionals who deserved the same respect given to any other member of the security services. The casual dismissiveness that had contributed to the original confrontation largely disappeared from police culture. Tourism at Buckingham Palace increased noticeably in the weeks following the incident, as people hoped to see some kind of repeat performance. Guides began incorporating stories about the Guards' backgrounds into their tours, explaining that the men in the red tunics were active military personnel with extensive training and combat experience. The tourists listened with new appreciation for what they were witnessing. Thomas noticed the change in how people looked at him during his shifts. Where there had once been casual curiosity and occasional attempts to make him react, there was now a more respectful distance and genuine admiration. Parents pointed him out to their children with explanations about service and dedication. Other military personnel visiting as tourists would sometimes offer subtle nods of recognition and respect. The video continued to circulate for months, inspiring countless discussions about the nature of strength, professionalism, and the difference between appearances and reality. Military recruitment offices reported increased interest from young people who had been inspired by seeing someone use their skills with such precision and restraint. The message seemed to resonate. Real strength was about more than just winning fights. Blake eventually transferred to a different division, partly because he never quite recovered from the embarrassment of the incident. He became a more thoughtful and humble officer, but the memory of being so thoroughly outclassed by someone he had dismissed as decorative stayed with him throughout his career. In some ways, it made him a better police officer, more careful about assumptions and more respectful of people he didn't fully understand. Patterson and Rodriguez both stayed in their current roles, but they became advocates for better inter-service cooperation and understanding. They volunteered for training programs that brought police and military personnel together, helping to build relationships that prevented the kind of misunderstanding that had led to their confrontation with Thomas. The broader impact of the incident extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Military and police training programs began incorporating more education about the roles and qualifications of different security services. The goal was to ensure that all personnel understood and respected the capabilities and contributions of their colleagues in other branches of service. Thomas continued his duties as a ceremonial guard for another 3 years before accepting a promotion that moved him to a training role. His experience with the 3 police officers became part of the curriculum he taught to new guards, illustrating the importance of maintaining professionalism even under provocation. He emphasized that their role was not just ceremonial but representational. They carried the reputation of the entire service in their conduct. The incident became part of the unofficial folklore of both the police and military services in London. New officers and new guards all heard the story, usually with embellishments that made it more dramatic than it actually was. But the core message remained consistent. Never underestimate someone based on their appearance, and always treat fellow professionals with the respect they deserve. years later. When Blake, Patterson, and Rodriguez had all moved on to other roles and other challenges, they would occasionally find themselves telling the story to younger colleagues. It had become their favorite cautionary tale about pride, assumptions, and the unexpected education that can come from being thoroughly outclassed by someone you thought you understood. The lesson endured long after the individuals involved had moved on with their lives. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones where you choose not to pursue them completely, and sometimes the greatest strength is shown through restraint rather than force.